people don't wake up in the morning to fail. They want to do a good job. Thing is, there was a voicemail from my direct boss saying Charlie needs to do a better job with the carpenter organization. And, you know, I, I'm kind of disappointed in this. And my trust with my boss just went down to the bot to as low as it could be. Their immediate reaction is fight, fight, fight. Let's resist that. Let's resist that. I can't do that.
Hello and welcome, team, to this week's episode of the ET Project. Most of you are leaders, so I know you'll know that great leadership isn't learned just from textbooks alone. It's forged through real-world experiences, whether it's the highs, the challenges, those moments of growth that arise out of the places often unexpected. And today we're going to dive into our favorite subject on this show, leadership. And we're going to look at the powerful intersection between private life and professional career with somebody who's lived it at every level. So please join me as we explore the valuable lessons learned on the front line from fast food through to corporate suite. And welcome our guest, Charlie Newcomb. Charlie, it's a delight to have you here with us today.
Yes, thank you, Wayne, for the opportunity. It's great.
You've recently released a book earlier this year, if I'm correct, called Life, Leadership and Success,
Correct.
Purposeful Lessons and
Yes.
Strategy for Managing Teams and Impact. Now, we're going to spend most of our conversation diving into that. We'll be discussing many of the topics found between the cover of the book. So before we do that, though, let's perhaps jump into a little bit of your background, even though you do introduce it in the book, but perhaps starting with the journey from deciding to leave uni and move into McDonald's.
Yeah, I'm sorry, leave where? Because I started at McDonald's while I was going to school.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe step out of college or in the first after the first semester and then move
Sure.
into McDonald's. Yeah.
Yeah, my first experience with college, it seemed to be the thing to do back in the late 70s. Okay, you got to go to college. That seemed to be the way of life, and I obliged and thought I would do the right thing, and I decided to take a major in computer science, and that was going to be my career. But honestly, didn't know a lot about computers, and I realized after one semester that I was kind of spending my money on something I wasn't sure was going to be a good benefit. So I decided not to return for the second semester, returned to home, and I figured I had to pay my bills somehow, and took a part-time job at McDonald's while I figured it out. And I eventually did decide to go to school, back to school locally in Portland, Maine, and I was going to be a police officer. And so I took a part-time job at McDonald's to start paying the bills. And I tell you, I realized real quick within the first few days that I really liked working at McDonald's. I liked working around people. And I always believe I wrote about in my book that, everything happens for a reason. And you see that in a lot of places. A lot of people say it, but, I kind of lived it. And I took some of those things as omens to, start my career. Instead of going into law enforcement, went into, the management program at McDonald's. And I love the customer interaction. I love working with the team. There's so many great skills that I learned at my job at McDonald's. And lo and behold, I never expected to last 33 years. And, I was blessed with some great training, worked with some great people. I always try to have somebody in the McDonald's system, in any job actually, somebody as a mentor that would help, bring me along and help me learn the ropes.
Right.
And here I was as an 18-year-old, not exactly sure what I wanted to do in life, and but I realized within that first year of working at McDonald's that, I had a real opportunity to grow my career in McDonald's, and work my way up. So.
Mm.
They paid with a lot of great training. They invested in me, and 33 years later, I'm still learning even in my jobs now, three jobs since McDonald's, I'm still learning. And that's what it's always about is continuous improvement, always learning, trying to make yourself better. What are you doing today to make tomorrow better? That's
Mm,
usually my mantra that I live by.
right. You mentioned mentors. Is mentorship, or does McDonald's offer a mentoring program?
No, not really an official program.
Right.
It's something that you find somebody that you aspire to be, somebody that you look up to
Mm,
that can help you, guide you. And, I had some great store managers that, I learned from. And, what I quickly realized over time was people are always watching you, no matter what job you're in. They're watching how you react to certain situations. Um, I call that, kind of like I guess it's a leadership style, an emotional intelligence. How do you
mm,
react to a situation? If you're in an automobile accident, how do you react if you get hit? Or if you're in a restaurant and all of a sudden one of your fryer laters catches on fire, how do you react? Do you panic and get everyone uptight and reacting in a crazy way, and somebody coming along throwing water on an oil fire, which would be
right.
a big no-no.
Yeah.
It's those are the things that people are always watching you, and even to this day, I watch leaders. I watch subordinates. I watch some of the mid managers that they're in their current levels. How do they react to certain situations, and you can always learn by how people react.
Mm.
So,
I know you talk a lot about the difference between managers and leaders, and I'm wondering, were there any early experiences during that period that sort of helped you shape your understanding of that difference?
uh, I knew in my time that I felt I was a natural leader, and I always aspired to do better, to improve upon myself. And, a lot of times we think a good crew person or a good associate at a CVS, for example,
Mm,
might make a good manager because they do a good job stocking the shelves. Or in the McDonald's world, if you're a cashier and waiting on customers, just because you did a good job and were friendly to the customers, people thought you could automatically be a manager. And you find out quickly that people don't have those leadership traits that you
mm,
would like them to have. I'll tell you a little trick that I used one time.
mm,
I put up a notice in the back room to said to anybody, if you are interested in being a shift manager, please sign up below and see what happens. And what you find is people signing up that you automatically would think that you dismiss. Oh, Sean, he doesn't do a very good job as a crew person now. I don't think he's going to make a good manager. But just by putting that list up, you get a list of people that are willing to take an initiative to try to do better.
mm,
So of those people that signed up, I remember, what can we do to work with the Sean to make him do a better job?
right.
And then you find out they actually have some pretty good leadership skills.
Mm,
Maybe they're a little bit quiet, maybe, shy, but they really care about doing a good job and they help train others sometimes. I mean, there's so many good traits that people have that you never would expect. So I just remember just by putting a simple sign up sheet on the back, by the time clock, you really identified people that maybe had an interest in growing a career. Who knows?
that's quite a powerful method of identifying potential leaders of the future. It
Yep.
sounds so
Mhm.
simple, but really powerful. You
Exactly.
mentioned multiple times since we started our conversation the word crew member or crew. Is that a terminology that McDonald's specifically uses for its staff?
For the most part, but I think it's very common in any quick service restaurant.
Okay.
Uh, and I think also in a like a fast casual dining experience like Longhorns or Texas Roadhouse, you've got some the associates. Maybe they not might not be crew, but they might be a waiter type thing. So entry level position, I guess, for any job. And I think one of the things that I mentioned in my book is it's not just about food service. We have many transferable skills in our
Mm,
jobs. And I remember a couple people that, I remember one former HR person told me, here I was, I think 45 years old, wanting to change careers in McDonald's. And he said to me that you have so many transferable skills that you may not realize it. And the
right.
best time of your career to change jobs is between 40 and 55 because you have the experience and you already know what you're capable of doing. You have those leadership traits already built in you and
Mm.
companies love the experience. So, and it worked out.
And to that point, I mean, you're essentially now working in an industry which is, if I recall our earlier conversation, it's a supplier to McDonald's. What are you doing at the moment?
I currently work for Manitowoc Ice. I,
Mm.
uh, Manitowoc is one of the two globally approved ice machines for McDonald's. So I sell ice machines for McDonald's, and I have one account, McDonald's only, and I travel the world. So, I've been to, I think, about 20 different countries in the last 3 years. It's been a unique experience.
Sounds like the dream job.
It is a great dream job.
Congratulations. So
Thank you.
let's transfer a little bit into the book, although much of what we've spoken about is already in the book. But the book, after 33 years of leadership, maybe more now, what was the inspiration? Why write the book?
It was something I always wanted to do. I, I've been blessed with some great training. McDonald's invested a lot of money. They paid for me to take a 1 minute manager presentation. Ken Blanchard wrote the 1 minute manager. They paid for me to take a seminar that from Stephen Covey, and a lot of those discussion points for both Stephen Covey's presentation and Ken Blanchard really struck a chord. And I live those. I still live those learnings to today. A good example of that is, Ken Blanchard talked about, he's famous for the 1 minute manager, and always, coaching, giving feedback, the 1 minute praise. I can't kind of came up with a phrase on my own. I called it praise in public, criticize in private. It's kind of one of those things that I live by. People don't want to hear you criticizing about someone else because then they think, what do you do when they're not looking?
Yeah,
But anyway, Ken Blanchard was really good about, you know, giving constant coaching. And at the same time, he talked about goal setting. Make sure that they're realistic. They talk about the SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time frame. And I'm kind of rambling on a little bit, but I'm pretty passionate about this. And a lot of times, what you see managers do is they'll give you their goals. Let's say they'll give you your new goals on January 1st. Then all of a sudden, your 6 month performance review comes up, and come the end of June, and you haven't been given any updates on where you are in your goals. And all of a
right.
sudden, your boss comes up to you and says, "Hey, Charlie, I've talked to you about, you need to improve profitability or your labor cost in your on your shifts." And you kind of get zapped for that because you didn't meet your goal. Well, if you're not kind of given the score along the way, how do you know how you're doing?
Right.
Uh, I remember, working with new shift managers and experienced shift managers. I would give them feedback every day that they would run their shifts. So come the time I did their performance reviews, there was no surprises.
Right.
Uh, my first review that I had at my current job with Manitowoc Ice, uh, back, 3 years ago at this point, but my boss said to me, there's nothing on your performance review that you will not have heard from me already. And it brought up this whole 20-minute conversation about the 1 minute manager and Ken Blanchard. He was very well familiar with that.
Yeah.
And, we had a great discussion about it. And he's right. Everything we talked about on the performance review, he had already told me about. So, in theory, your performance review should only take you a few minutes. If you've already talked about and given updates throughout that 6 month period, there should be no surprises. And there are some bosses out there that are afraid to give honest feedback about somebody that might be struggling in a certain area. Instead of asking questions about why they may be struggling,
Mm.
they just assume that they're just not doing a good job. And people don't wake up in the morning to fail. They want to do a good job. So again, constant coaching, constant feedback is such an important, discussion point with Ken Blanchard. I mentioned, see, I can talk on and on here, Wayne. Stephen Covey was, the seven seven habits of highly effective people. I mean, I live so many of those principles that he talks about. I'm the first one to ask a question. And sometimes when I ask a question, I'll say, I'm asking this question seeking understanding, because sometimes you've got a new procedure coming up or a new product coming out. And I'm trying to ask questions to understand what's expected.
Yeah.
The other thing he talks about is begin with the end in mind. What does a new product look like? What should we expect for sales results? What are some of the barriers that you run into when achieve good results?
Yeah.
So I
You
hope I
also
hope I answered your question, Wayne. I don't know.
no, no issue at all. You also talk about Dale Carnegie. So what was the influence he had on your career?
Well, I tell you, it sounds silly, and I talk about this in my book that remembering names. And I'm sure everyone can relate to a time. Let's say you and I were talking, and an old friend of mine came up, we'll call him Doug, comes up to me and starts talking. Well, here you are. I'm carrying on a conversation with Doug. What I really should be doing is introducing you to.
Mm.
Hey, Doug, here's my colleague Wayne, so that they can, so that you can join in on the conversation, and you can feel comfortable with it. And at the same time, another thing that happens is, you talk to different people throughout your career, and then, it might be 2 years later, you run into them again. And what Dale Carnegie taught me was it's okay to say, hey, I don't quite remember your name. Please, my name's Charlie. Don't assume they remember your name either.
Yeah.
And it they can talk at ease about that. Hey, my name's Josh. And then you kind of reconnect and say how the family and whatever that may be. But that's I'll tell you, that was the first class they talked about in Dale Carnegie that really stood out to me. And the other one that stood out to me, I think it was the fourth week of Dale Carnegie, when they tell you to bring in a newspaper, and that what they want you to do is stand up in front of a group and slam the newspaper down and say, I hate my job, or I am so pissed off at certain people. And the purpose of that exercise was really to get you to, or how I interpret it is, to say what you want without having to slam something down on the table. Because we've all had bosses that all of a sudden they walk into a room, they slam down a book, and instantly their audience or their employees just stop talking, and they're like on guard. And again, what it taught me is you can still say you're upset. And that led me to some great conflict management training. You know, I joke about the time my manager came up to me and said, Charlie, you have bad breath. And it really, my first reaction was, thank you so much for telling me. And it how what amazed me was how easy he had a job of managing that conflict. Now it's a small thing. We've all had somebody that has body odor, and we're afraid to say something to them. We think they're going to be embarrassed. We don't want to make them feel embarrassed, but they got to know that it's not right. Uh,
Mm,
Another good one is like somebody wearing too much perfume.
mm,
If you're in a room full of people, there is sometimes people walking, they just overpower the room with perfume.
right.
It's uh it's a little thing, but I guess the subject is really about conflict.
Mm,
And that also goes to home life. That goes to anything, any part of your life is, your kids do something wrong, address it. Tell them it's not acceptable, so they'll learn. And that's how we learn is just by addressing conflict, being honest with people. It only hurts for a couple minutes.
yeah.
It's hard to do that. So again,
It
sorry.
sounds like there's an undercurrent theme there of being authentic. So be
Yeah.
present, show up, be authentic, and things flow somewhat more naturally. Uh, how do you incorporate authenticity into your day-to-day leadership?
I think that's something that you have to do naturally. I mean, I've learned from my wife about that. She's really good about diffusing a situation with kindness.
Mm,
I just kind of state the facts. Sometimes I'm too serious if I say something, but she has a way to say it in such a nice way that you don't get upset. And so I even learned from that.
mm,
Try to talk softly. I found myself talking too sternly, and I've learned because of her is to talk softly.
right.
Um, so, but yeah,
Well,
no,
one of the key skills that you really highlight is effective communication. And I think you've already, you know, demonstrated a lot of that in this conversation already. But where does communication or miscommunication show up as leadership or as part of your leadership? Like what's some of the traps that you've seen with leaders and their communication style?
yeah. I mean, I've seen it both opposites of the both opposite spectrums. So you've got the folks that are really good about communicating, communicating expectations, and I
Mm,
always try to think about if I'm in their position, what do I want my people to know? And I have to write those things down because a lot of time that we assume that's the other part of ineffective communication. We assume that they know what they're doing. And we also want to encourage questions.
mm,
A lot of times in an environment, a group setting, there are people afraid to ask questions. And sometimes you kind of got to fish that out. And sometimes if an effective communicator doesn't communicate it, they just remain silent. And that was a great skill in facilitation training that I went through is, ask a question and then just be silent. When you
mm,
first do that, it is so awkward. You just want to, say something, but if you can just resist the urge to say something, eventually somebody's going to say something to break that ice and and,
mm,
and talk. But so, communication is good, but there's so many different facets with it. You got to be a good listener. Uh, and a lot of times, uh, Stephen Covey talks about this. A lot of times people listen to respond. And you see it happen so much. If I'm talking about something, about a plan of action, and somebody's watching me and listening to me, and all of a sudden they turn around and say, "Well, I think we should do this." Well, they didn't even acknowledge what I had said. They just kind of were listening to what I had to say to spew out their own ideas, what they
mm,
think we should do. So communication takes so many different avenues. I mean, uh, and sometimes, there are quiet communicators.
mm,
You don't, I always started expecting people to talk above everyone else as a communicator. And I quickly learned that someone can be an effective communicator. You just may not hear them doing that all the time. They could be quietly training somebody. They just not. talking loud in a store or in the environment that they're at. So, like I said, communication takes so many different forms of little winding, routes, turns in the road.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And as you point out, it's such a broad topic, and there's so many individual components to it. One of the things I've noticed myself in my own career, Charlie, is communication, authenticity. All of these are factors that help build that trust. I'm wondering your experience in how do leaders go about building trust? It's such an essential um, communication, authenticity, all of these things we've spoken about. Is there any methodology that you try and incorporate as a leader to establish trust?
I'll tell you, trust trust is so tricky. I've always, and I write about this in my book, that
Mm,
trust is, if we meet, if when we first talk or anybody I first meet, they have my ultimate trust. I trust what they say.
yeah,
Hopefully they trust what I say. But then if you find out that what they tell you is different than they tell somebody else, then they shoot, trust can be shot down in a moment's notice.
yeah.
And to build that back up takes so much time to learn to trust them again. And, keeping your promises. If you promise to try to help somebody, get a pay raise, or if you try to trust them to maybe get an extra vacation day, and you don't do anything about it. If you make a commitment to promise that you'll do something and you don't come through on that promise,
Mm,
how are they going to believe you the next time you say something? And what I wrote an example in my book that talks about trust being shot down immediately. I was with one of the superiors traveling, different restaurants in my McDonald's days, and all of a sudden he went to listen to his voicemail and the voice, on his speaker. So that's a mistake right there. A leader
yeah.
should not be letting me listen to his voicemails. But the next thing is there was a voicemail from my direct boss saying Charlie needs to do a better job with the carpenter organization. And, you know, I, I'm kind of disappointed in this. And my trust with my boss just went down to as low as it could be because
Mm,
he never had told that to me.
right.
If I had heard that from him before, it wouldn't have been a big deal. And I'd say to the person I'm with, "Hey, Bob, that he's absolutely right. This is what we've talked about. This is what I'm working on, and this is how I'm trying to correct that situation with this organization."
Mm,
But instead, my trust for him was shot down. And what else is he saying about me to other people?
yeah.
And I'll tell you, I learned so much from that one example that I never say anything to a boss unless my person that reports to me has heard it from me already. And that should be a cardinal rule. But
Mm.
so that's a great example that I talk about in the trust in my book. It's so easy to shoot it down in no time. It just takes so long to build it back up.
And there could be so many reasons behind your boss, your direct boss's purpose in doing that. Uh, not the right reasons, by the way, but there could be so many reasons, and it comes full circle then back to the conflict, right? And dealing with how do you address that then now that you've been made privy um, when you come back and confront your direct boss, right? So
That's
I'd be
right.
interested. How
Yep.
did you deal with that situation?
Yep. Yep. So I thought I had a quote in my book about trust, but I can't find it off the tip of my tongue.
No, no problem. I mean, closely aligned with conflict is the feedback. So constructive feedback is something that we've probably all engaged in at times, particularly as leaders, our audience predominantly leaders. how do you approach giving somebody that constructive feedback? You've already touched on, you do it regularly, but is there a way that you've found works better than other ways when you have to give maybe not positive feedback, but you know, areas where somebody's challenged, they need support, they need to change something? Any
Yeah.
tips on?
Yeah, I would tell you the first thing that people do, it's so natural. What a boss will say to you, where you'll go sit down and talk, and they may say something like, Charlie, you did a really good job handling this customer today,
Mm,
but you really got to do a better job doing X, Y, and Z. And then that X, Y, and Z becomes a 10-minute conversation. So they
mm,
feel that they need to sugarcoat, butter you up by giving you a quick 15-second, 10-second compliment.
yeah,
And then you say but, and that's the other word I mentioned in my book is you don't need the word but. And you don't even need to sugarcoat with a compliment. Let's talk about how I think you could do a better job doing a situation and kind of do a role play.
yeah,
Again, it is about also being honest, specific examples, you know, don't say, I don't like your attitude. Attitude to you and attitude to Henry down the street are two different meanings,
yeah,
mean two different things. So what is it specifically that you felt was my attitude? Was it how I spoke to customers? Was it how I, talked to a fellow employee? What specifically did you say that you thought I have a bad attitude?
yeah,
And so that the feedback can't be diluted. You
yeah,
know, you have a terrible personality. Well, what specifically on my personality don't you like?
yeah, exactly.
And so that's what I say about feedback is one, you don't have to people always feel they have to give you this compliment. And then what you get this reputation and you're sitting there, okay, here he is. I'm listening to the compliment, but you really don't, that isn't what you want to talk about. You want to talk about the opportunities.
Yeah,
Just let's get it over with. So I don't even hear what you say is for the positives.
yeah,
And so,
for
and
sure.
sometimes you can just leave it alone as a positive.
Yeah.
Hey, great job today. I liked how you handled the customer. I liked how you handled, handling that customer complaint and leave it at that. So,
And back to Blanchard's methodology, the 1 minute manager, you can address these issues so quickly on the spot while it's still relevant to the situation. You can do it in a way that nobody is really hurt by it. They learn and they grow from it. Right.
yeah, I think Ken Blanchard calls that the 1 minute praise. So
The 1 minute plans.
if
Yeah.
you have an associate wants to work on customer interaction or handling a complaint, and all of a sudden they get a complaint, compliment them right then and there. Hey, that you handled that perfectly. So that person, that associate feels good about himself that, one, he listened to you. So you feel good about the fact he listened to you.
Yeah.
And two, he feels good about it. And he continues to set that example and repeat the good things.
Interestingly, probably the reason a lot of people give the praise first is that there's so many training programs out there that teach you to do that, right? That say you sandwich the compliments either end of the tough discussion, and thankfully today there's new ideals out there that say that's maybe not the best way to do it. And to your point, right? So we're both singing from the same hymn sheet in this regard. There's a much more effective way of giving feedback, whether it's positive or negative. And I believe the frequent feedback is so much more powerful
Yeah,
than waiting for that performance review, like you mentioned.
correct.
So
Yeah.
we're both on the same sheet. So we've touched on a number of topics already, right? So we're going quickly through it, and you cover these in more detail in the book, of course. Another area is around change. It's
Yes.
it's one of the biggest challenges that we see in our business world today and likely to remain one of the biggest challenges going forward, given everything that's happening.
Yes.
What's your message around managing the change process, working with the team? How do you deal with it?
My motto is, I'm just trying to think of a quick saying that came to top of my mind at one point in time, but there are certain things that are certain in life, and I can't remember all of them, but one is change.
Yeah,
Especially in the work environment, procedures are constantly changing. Um, Systems and routines are constantly changing. And you think about our daily life, as you go through life, you change how you handle modern technology. And I'll give you a good example. Years ago, 15 years ago, I worked out of a manual calendar. I carried a 12-month calendar of the year, and I would open up to certain days and say, okay, we can do this on this day. We can go visit a restaurant, or we can talk about performance reviews on this day.
right.
And when they came out with an electronic calendar, I resisted that. But at the same time, now I should say now I can't imagine going back to that old calendar because I finally evolved. And so my message is always you got to recognize that change is always going to be a constant in your life, and you've got to adapt to change. And look at the electronics in a car. With the smart, or smart TV at your home, so much more streaming. There's so many people that have cable TV that don't want to change to go to streaming service, but
Mm,
they can save a boatload of money by doing that.
yeah,
So it's in our life. It's in social media's change. It affects our moods, and companies are always changing. Ownership you know takes over a certain company. They have a change in procedures, and I
right.
tell people absorb that, think about it, don't make irrational decisions, recognize that you're going through some change, recognize that a week from now you're going to feel better about that. And for me, what I say is once I get a good night's sleep, I can digest some of this change overnight on my own, and then I'm ready to conquer it, the next day.
Okay.
So, change, like I said, change is a constant, and we have to change. We always have to change our way in order to really survive. And, that sounds so crazy, but really survive a job change. Uh, I went through my first, leaving McDonald's after 33 years. That was a big change, and I remember walking out on my last day of work out of the office, and you're questioning yourself, am I doing the right thing? And
Mm,
deep inside your heart that, yeah, at that time I was doing the right thing. So, instincts can take over and help you manage change if you know in your heart that it's the right thing to do. And people
yeah.
struggle with change and sometimes resistant to change, and they don't survive. It's hard.
Being a Stephen Covey fan, I'm sure you know his quote, and it's probably the one you're thinking of. The only constant is change. Um,
Yes, thank you. That's right. Yep.
the whole premise of change often perplexes me. I mean, as you've mentioned, we experience change almost every day of our life. It,
Yep.
it's it's seems to be more challenging for people in the workplace than it is in their personal life. Mainly because they have more control, I guess. They feel at least they have more control from a personal perspective in their own life than they do within the workforce. How do you nurture a team when you're introducing some change initiative? Like how do you bring them along on the journey so that they're not those who are fearful, they're not the ones who are resisting? Do you have any experience yourself that comes to mind?
Yeah, I would tell you the first thing that I always do is I go back to Stephen Covey. He talks about begin with the end in mind in creating a vision as to what that change is going to look like.
Right.
Also acknowledging to the group that this is a paradigm shift,
Mm,
that, I need your support. I need you to manage this change. And immediately they're thinking, okay, I'm with you. I'm going to help you, because you need them on your side. And you also acknowledge that it's going to be difficult.
Right.
And you also make sure that they're not going to do it the next day. It's a gradual change. And a
Yeah.
lot of times where I think managers fail is they want you to go from A to Z overnight. And you
Mm.
need to go through the rest of the alphabet first. It's baby steps and recognizing and acknowledging when somebody's trying to make that change. It's hard to do. It's hard to sometimes manage that, but so where managers fail is not understanding the feelings that their subordinates are going through. So they need to acknowledge that change, that they're having a tough time with it, and try to help them through that and continually talk about it. And eventually it becomes a habit. It takes, Stephen Covey talks about it takes 21 days to change a habit. It's so true. I go back to my electronic calendar. Took me probably about a month to get used to it, but um, you it's becomes a way of life. Once you accept it, it's much easier. And then you always see people realize, hey, you were right. To go through that, we're better for this. We're better as a result.
Mm. Mm.
And sometimes you see it like setting a goal. A lot of times you have a good year, and then you set a goal for next year, and you think, oh my God, I just did a 15% increase, and you want me to do another 10% sales increase? That's impossible. And so their immediate reaction is fight, fight, fight. Let's resist that. Let's resist that. I can't do that. I can't do that.
Mm.
But again, you create that vision of what that's going to look like. How are you going to feel if you can achieve another 10% sales increase on top of what you just did?
Yeah.
And yeah, so change is always happening, always
It's always
changing.
happening. And with technology the way it is at the moment, the rapidness or the speed of change in
Yeah.
today's world and business environment is creating this complexity. It's creating a need to be so adaptable. From a leader's point of view, I also see the stresses happening with leaders in dealing with the change, not only in helping their team deal with the change, but themselves coping with it. And quite often it shows up in that work-life balance, and they find themselves spending more and more time trying to deal with the work rather than somehow find that balance between their private and their professional lives. What's your take on that at the moment with the world that we're living in today and trying to
Yeah.
strike that
Yeah.
balance or synergy or harmony or whatever?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is your subordinates, your people that report to you are watching how you react. I
Mm.
mentioned that a little bit ago. And, that emotional intelligence, kind of kicks in at that point in time. And the other thing is you find that leaders, they still struggle with it. And what I've said to leaders about that is fake it till you make it. Don't let them know that you're upset,
Mm.
you know, and recognize as part of that change that, maybe that first few days of going through that, yeah, you have to work a little bit extra. But let your family know if it interferes with your personal time. I would have said to my wife in the past, I've got a long night coming up tonight because I got to do, this report's due tomorrow. And of course you learn to manage and get it done sooner. But back to your point about, I think initially when there's that thing that's happening, you're going to find that you naturally feel you need to kind of do it a little bit extra time, but communicate that to your family to let them know this is happening. And then eventually, after a couple of days, you get better at it. You learn to develop efficiencies and get better at managing your time. You realize very quickly that time management, you test it initially there because you're throwing something in there that you
Yeah.
got to just realign and kind of divvy up your time a little bit better. You realize it pretty quick.
Mm. Mm. And you mentioned something earlier in the conversation about having that vision. I think that's important for leaders to keep that broader perspective and realize this is a moment in time. It's not my life going forward. And
Yep.
if I can keep my sights on that horizon, everything's possible. We're always tight for time, Charlie. We've only scratched the surface in the book.
Yeah.
But is there one lesson or a concept from the book that you wish every leader could hear or learn and adopt?
There's a couple things that come to mind. The biggest thing I always talk about is constantly coaching, constantly giving feedback, and be honest about that feedback.
Mm,
And the other part of that I always, I'll tell you, I love quotes in my book. And the the best quote that I love, I've experienced it many times, is, I was recently faced with it, at my job where both of my immediate bosses, left their job and went on to new careers, different jobs.
mm,
And your first reaction was, oh, that's hard. How can I continue on with that? And the
right.
quote that I talk about is from Julia Roberts, and she says, "When people walk away from you, let them go. Your destiny is never tied to anyone who leaves you, and it doesn't mean they are bad people. It just means their part in your story is over."
Mm,
When I took my job, my current job at Manitowoc Ice, I love the job. I love the product. I love the people that I work with. And my bosses were bonus. And, all of a sudden, within a month of each other, both left. And I realized that I took this job for the company and the brand and what it represented, and that, their leaving wasn't going to control my destiny. So I took a lot of solace in that, and it made their departure a lot easier. And I try to tell that for other people, because there are a lot of other people in that same position as me, that it's okay.
mm.
It's a change, and I'm going to be better as a result, and I'm going to work harder as a result. And I wasn't successful because of them. I was successful because of who I am. So,
Yeah, very, very nice, very sound advice as well. One thing that stands out to me, Charlie, having come to this point in the communication or the conversation, is that you are you appear to be a very genuine, authentic individual, and I'm sure that
sure.
comes across in your leadership. It
Yes.
definitely aligns with what I read in your book. So I'd really encourage our listeners to go out there and get a copy of the book. As I said, we've just scratched the surface of what you
Yep.
talked about in there. Where can people go to get a copy?
Sure. The easiest way is Amazon.com. It's now a Amazon bestseller, which is great news.
Mm,
I also understand it's been released to other outlets, Barnes& and Noble, Walmart, etc. But it's life, leadership, and success. And excuse all my little tabs that I marked a lot of my quotes to refer to. But I'm really proud of the results so far. Sales have been very strong, and I always feel like I have to constantly teach and constantly set the example. And I use that with my family and my girls, that, they're watching, as parents, your children watch how you react. And there's so many life lessons that I talk about in my book as well that shaped who I am as a parent too.
yeah, definitely a great book. Please go out and get a copy. Where can people connect with you if they want to discuss different stories, different things, or what's the best
Sure.
way of
I
connecting?
was just going to add that you can connect with me on LinkedIn at Charlie Newcomb, and then my email is charlienewcomb@comcast.net. I'd be glad to talk to anybody. I'm looking to, make public speaking a part of my routine as well. So I'm looking for, group of, Home Depot managers potentially, or anybody that manages people. It's I can, my and it's not just about the corporate world, it's about life too, life experiences.
Mm. Well, definitely great connecting, Charlie. Really enjoyed our conversation. Please
Yes, Wayne. Thank you.
connect with Charlie, and I'm sure you won't be disappointed. So, Charlie, thanks for being on the ET project.
Yes, appreciate you having me.
So what are you waiting for? Hit the subscribe button below and click on the bell icon so I can pop up in your feed occasionally with a great tip for your ultimate growth.